A storm is rising, the wind is screaming, and a ship lies just off a rocky shore in the dark. The only thing standing between that ship and the rocks is a single shape buried in the mud far below. It weighs almost nothing compared to the ship, yet it holds against tons of wind and breaking wave. That shape is the anchor, and the harder the storm pulls, the harder it bites down into the seabed. To understand how something so small holds something so large, we have to follow the pull all the way down to the bottom. Let us start with the sheer scale of the thing, because the numbers here really are genuinely difficult to believe at first. A large ship can weigh many thousands of tons, a whole floating steel mountain shoved around endlessly by the wind and the current. And yet, the anchor holding it firmly in place might weigh only a tiny fraction of 1% of all that mass. It seems, on the face of it, completely impossible, rather like trying to hold a runaway truck in place with a garden trowel. Our deepest instinct tells us, very firmly, that to hold something heavy, you simply need something even heavier to weigh it down. And for most of human history, that exact instinct is more or less precisely how people first tried to anchor their boats in the water. The very earliest anchors were just that, heavy things, usually nothing more than a single large, awkward stone tied onto the end of a rope. You dropped your heavy stone over the side, it sank straight to the bottom, and its sheer dead weight held you roughly in place. This crude method does technically work, but only for small boats, only in fairly calm water, and only up to a very modest point. The problem is that holding power from pure weight alone grows painfully slowly, while the forces of wind and water grow terrifyingly fast. To hold a real ship against a real storm using nothing but dead weight, your stone would have to be almost as heavy as the ship itself. You would, in effect, need to carry a whole second ship made of solid rock, just to stop the first one from drifting away. So weight, all on its own, is a hopeless dead end. And somewhere along the line, people made a genuinely brilliant mental leap. They suddenly realized that the seabed itself was right there, vast and utterly solid, and that the real trick was not to sit on it, but to grab it. If you could somehow reach down and take a firm, biting grip on the bottom of the sea, you would not need to be heavy at all. You would simply need to hold on tightly and then let the enormous, immovable earth itself do all of the actual hard work of resisting. And that single shift in thinking, from weighing down to holding on, is the entire secret hidden inside an anchor's strange and clever shape. Every curve, every point, and every careful angle of a modern anchor exists to do just one thing: to dig in and grip the seabed. So let us now take a proper, close, unhurried look at this strange and very deliberate shape, piece by careful piece. The long central bar of the anchor, the part that the rope or the chain attaches to up at the top, is called the shank. At the very bottom of that shank, the heavy metal splits and curves outward into two strong, sweeping, symmetrical arms. The point where those arms meet the shank, right at the bottom, is the crown, the solid hinge of the whole design. And on the end of each of those two curving arms sits the single most important part of all: a broad, flattened, sharply pointed blade. These pointed blades are called the flukes, and they are the parts that actually do the gripping, biting down hard into the seabed. Everything else about the anchor exists, in the end, simply to drive those two flukes deep into the bottom and hold them firmly there. It is worth pausing for a moment to notice that this very same shape appears at every imaginable size, from the tiny to the truly enormous. A small folding anchor for a little dinghy might sit quite comfortably in the open palm of just one of your hands. The anchor for a giant container ship, by stark contrast, can stand taller than a grown person and weigh more than a family car. And yet, despite that absolutely staggering difference in scale, Every single one of them is carefully built around the exact same clever idea. The same shank, the same curving arms, and the same biting pointed flukes appear again and again, simply scaled up or scaled down. Whatever its size, an anchor is never really trying very hard to be heavy. It is always, only ever, trying to dig. Now, at first glance, you might very reasonably expect an anchor to work a little bit like a giant fishing hook. You might naturally imagine it snagging on a rock, catching firmly on something solid down there, and then simply hanging on for dear life. And the very oldest iron anchors really did work a little like that, hooking onto convenient rocks and lumps on the seabed. But snagging is hopelessly unreliable, because most of the seabed is not convenient rock at all, but soft, yielding sand and deep, sucking mud. You simply cannot hook onto mud because there is nothing solid there to catch, and a plain hook would just slide uselessly across the bottom. So the real genius of a modern anchor is that it does not actually try to hook onto the seabed. It tries instead to bury itself completely inside it. This is the part that feels almost magical the very first time that you genuinely understand exactly what is going on. When the anchor first lands on the bottom, it is honestly doing almost nothing at all, just lying there flat on its side in the sand. By itself, lying flat like that, it has essentially no holding power at all, and the very gentlest pull would just slide it along the bottom. But now watch closely what happens the moment the ship begins to drift and the chain starts to pull the anchor sideways across the seabed. As the shank is dragged steadily along, the sharp tips of the flukes are tilted downward, and they catch and begin to scratch into the bottom. And the very instant those sharp pointed tips bite in, the whole clever shape of the anchor turns that flat horizontal pull into a powerful downward dig. This really is the crucial idea of the entire video, so it is genuinely worth slowing right down to see exactly what is happening here. The anchor is deliberately built at one very specific angle so that when you pull hard on the shank, the flukes are driven not backward, but downward. Pulling the anchor sideways does not simply drag it across the surface of the bottom. Instead, it levers those sharp flukes down and into the seabed. And the harder the ship pulls, the more force is fed straight down into those flukes. And so the deeper they slice into the bottom. So the anchor actually digs itself in, scooping and burrowing forward, dragging itself down beneath the surface of the seabed entirely. Within just a few short meters of dragging, a really good anchor can pull itself completely underground, vanishing down into the sand or the mud. If all of this is still hard to picture clearly, do try a very simple experiment the next time you happen to be standing on a sandy beach. Lay your flat hand gently on the wet sand, then drag it slowly along while quietly tilting your fingertips down into the surface. You will feel your hand stop, simply sitting on the sand, and instead start slicing down into it, throwing up a little wedge ahead. The harder and the lower down that you pull, the deeper your fingers dive, behaving exactly as an anchor's flukes do far underwater. A gardener's spade does the very same thing, biting steadily deeper into the soil the moment that you angle it and lean your weight onto it. An anchor really is just that same humble little idea, a blade driven down into the ground by nothing more than a steady, dragging pull. And this is the beautiful, almost paradoxical heart of the whole thing. The part that quietly defies all of our usual instincts. The very force that is trying so hard to pull the anchor loose is the exact same force that drives it deeper down and makes it hold. A gentle pull sets it only lightly, but a violent, screaming, storm force pull drives it down hard and buries it completely beneath the bottom. So the anchor is not really fighting the storm so much as quietly feeding on it, using the storm's own raw fury to dig itself in harder. Once it is fully buried, the anchor is held by the simply enormous weight and resistance of all the packed sand and mud pressing in around it. To pull it straight backward now, you would have to drag a huge, heavy wedge of the entire seabed along with it. Sailors actually have a special word for this whole careful process of getting the anchor to dig in and grip the bottom properly. They call it setting the anchor, and it is something they do very deliberately and very consciously every single time that they stop. After first dropping the anchor over the side, they will often gently reverse the boat, deliberately pulling back on the chain to drag the flukes through the bottom. They are quite deliberately encouraging the anchor to bite, to tip over onto its sharp points and burrow down until it is firmly and properly set. A skilled sailor can actually feel the difference straight through the chain between an anchor that is skidding along and one that has truly dug in. When it finally sets, the taut chain goes suddenly hard and the whole boat stops dead, held by a grip that can resist astonishing force. And only then, once it is properly set and buried deep, will the careful sailor really trust that anchor to hold them safely through the night. What is genuinely remarkable here is just how much sheer force a properly set anchor can quietly resist compared to its own really quite modest weight. A good modern anchor buried firmly in clean sand can hold many times over, sometimes more than 20 or 30 times its own weight. That means a manageable lump of metal that you could comfortably lift by hand can calmly resist a steady pull measured in many tons. None of that astonishing strength actually comes from the anchor itself at all, but from the vast, packed mass of seabed gripping in around it. The anchor is really just a very clever handle, a simple way of taking a firm and lasting hold of the immense and immovable earth. And the better and sharper its shape, the more of that buried earth it can quietly recruit to help it hold the whole ship in place. But there is now a second great secret here, one that is honestly just as important as the clever shape of the flukes themselves. Because none of that careful digging actually works at all unless the anchor is being pulled in exactly the right direction, which is sideways. Remember that the flukes will only bite and dig down when the pull on the shank stays roughly horizontal, dragging gently along the seabed, but the ship is floating high up on the surface, far above the anchor, so its natural pull always wants to angle steeply upward. And an upward pull is an absolute disaster, because lifting the shank simply levers the flukes back out of the ground and breaks them free. So somehow, the pull coming down from a ship floating high above must be patiently turned into a gentle, sideways tug along the bottom. The clever solution to this awkward problem is not really in the anchor at all, but in the long, heavy line that connects it to the ship. This connecting line, whether it happens to be made of rope or of chain, has its own proper name among sailors, and that name is the rode. And on most serious seagoing vessels, a long length of that rode, the part right next to the anchor, is made of heavy iron chain. That length of chain is quietly doing something far more clever than simply being strong, because its real and vital job here is to be heavy. The sheer dead weight of all that chain makes it sag down and lie flat along the seabed for a long stretch right near the anchor. And because the chain lies flat along the bottom like that, the pull that finally reaches the anchor itself arrives almost perfectly horizontal. This gentle, sagging, drooping curve of a long, heavy chain even has its own rather elegant name, borrowed straight from mathematics: the catenary. That catenary acts together like a long, soft spring and a shock absorber, lying along the seabed and quietly soaking up the sudden jerks of the waves. When a hard gust hits and the ship lurches back, it must first lift that heavy chain up off the bottom before any real pull even reaches the anchor. This clever arrangement means the anchor is shielded from the sharp, snatching shock loads, and instead it feels only a smoother, steadier, horizontal drag. The chain, in other words, is genuinely not just a passive link in the system. It is an active and absolutely vital part of the entire holding mechanism. Without that heavy chain lying flat along the bottom, even the very cleverest anchor in the whole world would simply be plucked straight back out. On many boats, careful sailors add one more clever little piece to this whole system, a short, stretchy length of rope called a snubber. They attach this snubber to the heavy chain and then let it take the strain so that it can stretch and absorb the very sharpest jerks. Chain itself does not stretch at all, not even slightly. So, without a snubber, every sudden snatch passes straight through to the anchor and the boat. The stretchy rope instead acts just like a soft, elastic cushion, gently smoothing out the violent tugs into something far steadier and kinder. Between the heavy, sagging chain and the stretching rope snubber, the buried anchor ends up wrapped in two entirely separate layers of shock protection. It is a beautifully complete little system, with every single part of it quietly working together to keep that one buried shape from ever breaking free. This is also exactly why experienced sailors are so very particular about letting out far more chain than just the simple depth of the water below. The length of rode that you let out, compared to the actual depth of the water, is a crucial number that sailors call the scope. If the water is only 5 meters deep, a careful sailor might let out 25 or even 35 meters of chain, far more than seems necessary. All of that generous extra length is exactly what allows the chain to lie down flat along the seabed and keep the vital pull horizontal. Let out too little chain, and the pull on the anchor angles sharply and dangerously upward, threatening to lift the buried flukes straight back out. So the holding power of any anchor depends not only on its clever shape, but also on giving it enough scope to actually work properly. There is also a quietly lovely consequence of anchoring from just a single point down on the seabed, one that you can watch in any harbor. A boat lying at anchor does not actually sit perfectly still, but slowly swings around its anchor as the wind and the tide gently change their direction. All through the long night, the whole boat quietly pivots in a great slow circle, always tethered to that one small buried shape down below. This is exactly why anchored boats are always spread so carefully far apart, so that none of them swing around and gently bump into a sleeping neighbor. The single anchor, far below in the dark, calmly holds the very center of that wide circle, no matter which way the wind happens to push. It is a strangely peaceful image, a heavy boat turning slow, patient circles in the dark, faithfully held by a shape that it cannot even see. So far, we have been talking about the anchor as if there were just one single universal design. But that is really far from the truth. In reality, there is a whole sprawling, fascinating family of different anchor shapes, and each one is a different answer to a different kind of seabed. Because the bottom of the sea is absolutely not just one single thing. It is fine sand in one place, thick, sticky mud in another, and bare, hard rock somewhere else again. And a fluke shape that buries itself beautifully and deeply in soft sand might skid uselessly across hard rock, or fail completely to grip slick, slimy weeds. So over the long centuries, and especially over the last 100 years or so, designers have created an entire strange menagerie of specialized anchor shapes. The classic anchor that most people instantly picture, with two curved arms and a straight crossbar up at the top, is the old Admiralty pattern. That crossbar, set deliberately at right angles to the flukes, is called the stock, and it has one very clever and specific job to do. When this old anchor lands on the bottom, the stock makes the whole thing roll over and tip up, forcing one of its two flukes to point downward and dig in. This venerable old design is wonderfully reliable on rock and on weed, where it tends to hook and snag firmly rather than trying to bury itself. But it is awkward and bulky, rather heavy for the holding power it gives, and it has a famously dangerous habit of fouling its own chain. So for the sandy and muddy bottoms, where the great majority of ships actually choose to anchor, engineers eventually designed something far more efficient. Some seabeds, though, simply refuse to be buried into at all. And there, the very old hooking idea quietly comes back into its own again. On bare, hard rock, no fluke can ever dig in. So sailors instead reach for anchors that grab and snag, like the old fisherman or a clawed grapnel. A grapnel, with its several curved hooks spreading out in every possible direction, is built specifically to catch on rock, on rubble, and on tangled wreck. Thick underwater weed is just as awkward and difficult, because the slippery leaves stop a fluke from ever quite reaching the firm ground hidden underneath. For weed, you really need a heavy, sharp anchor that can punch straight down through the green tangle and bite into the solid bottom below it. This is exactly why a really careful, experienced sailor will often quietly carry more than one type of anchor, ready for whatever the seabed turns out to be. One of the most successful of all is the lightweight fluke anchor, with two large, flat, sharply pointed blades hinged onto a long, thin shank. With its enormous flat surface area biting into the ground, it buries itself deep in sand and mud and holds many, many times its own modest weight. Another genuinely famous design is the plow anchor, shaped very much like a farmer's plow, which buries its single-pointed share down into the bottom. Then there is the claw, a chunky, rounded, one-piece shape that sets very quickly and reliably and stays forgiving across a wide range of different seabeds. And the modern designs, with their sharp, weighted, roll bar-shaped heads, are carefully engineered to dig in almost instantly and to resist being pulled out from almost any angle. Each single one of them is really just a slightly different solution to the very same ancient puzzle of how to grip an uncertain and completely invisible bottom. At the two far extremes of the whole anchor family, you actually find strange shapes that barely even look like anchors at all anymore. For permanent moorings, where something has to stay firmly put for years on end, people use the mushroom anchor, a heavy upturned dome that slowly sinks and is gripped by the mud. And at the truly giant end of the scale, a great ship's anchor is a colossal hinged shape of solid cast steel, swallowed by an opening in the bow called the hawse pipe. Its vast chain, with each single link as big as your whole forearm, rumbles heavily down from a chain locker buried deep inside the ship. When that one enormous anchor finally bites and sets, it can hold a vessel the length of several football pitches, steady against a screaming gale. And yet, for all of its colossal size, that giant anchor is still quietly doing the exact same humble job as the tiny folding one on a dinghy. And once you genuinely start looking at it this way, you can actually read the whole long history of human ingenuity in this single, humble, overlooked object. We began long ago with a simple, heavy stone, holding only by sheer dead weight, the most obvious and yet the least effective idea imaginable. Then came the early hooks of wood and of iron, snagging onto rocks, which was a real improvement, but was still hopelessly unreliable on soft ground. Then came the truly great leap, the realization that an anchor should actually bury itself and should turn the ship's pulling force into a downward grip. And finally came the modern burying anchors, carefully refined and tested and shaped by patient science to hold far more weight with far less metal. The whole long story of the anchor is really just the slow, clever, human story of learning to stop fighting weight and to start cleverly using shape. There is, of course, one very last thing that any anchor in the world absolutely must also be able to do, and that is to let go again. After all, an anchor that grips the seabed perfectly, but can then never ever be retrieved again, would be completely and totally useless to any sailor. And here, rather wonderfully, the very same clever geometry that buried the anchor so deeply is now used just as cleverly, but completely in reverse. To leave, the ship simply drives slowly forward until it is sitting directly above its own buried anchor, gathering in the chain as it goes. Now, for the very first time, the pull on the shank is no longer horizontal at all, but is instead pointing straight up toward the surface above. And that sudden upward pull, which would have been an absolute disaster back in the storm, now does exactly and precisely what you finally want it to. That clean vertical lift levers the deeply buried flukes backward and upward, breaking them out of the packed, heavy seabed that had been holding them so fiercely. The anchor, which only moments ago could happily resist many tons of force, now suddenly releases its iron grip and lifts cleanly up out of the bottom. Sailors even have a wonderful old phrase for this exact dramatic moment, the instant when the anchor first breaks free of the clinging seabed. They say that the anchor is aweigh, meaning that it is now hanging free in the water, no longer holding and ready to be hauled up. It is the very same word you hear in that famous old naval cry, "Anchors aweigh!" the ringing signal that a ship is finally free to sail away. And so the very same shape that fought so hard to hold the ship now gives it up willingly, the precise moment that the pull turns upward. Of course, anchors do also sometimes fail. And when they do, sailors call it by the single most dreaded word of all, dragging. An anchor drags when the buried flukes finally lose their grip and begin to skid helplessly along the bottom instead of staying properly buried. This can happen if the seabed is simply too hard, or far too soft, or too thickly weedy, or if the sailor carelessly let out far too little chain. A dragging anchor is genuinely terrifying, because it means the ship is now slowly, silently, invisibly sliding toward whatever happens to lie downwind, very often rocks. This is exactly why careful sailors fuss so very much over choosing the right anchor, the right patch of seabed, and the right amount of scope. They know all too well that the strange, clever shape only ever works when everything else is also right: the bottom, the chain, and the angle of the pull. It is really no accident at all, when you stop and think about it, that the anchor has become one of our very oldest and most beloved symbols. For many thousands of years now, the anchor has quietly stood for hope, for safety, and for steadfastness in the very face of a storm. Sailors proudly tattooed it onto their arms, and ancient peoples carefully carved it as a quiet, hopeful sign of refuge and of holding firm. And it really is a wonderfully fitting symbol, because that is precisely and exactly what the shape itself actually does, far down below the waves. It is the one single thing that simply refuses to let go, that grips on harder the more the whole world tries to tear it away. There is something genuinely, deeply human in that idea of a small, clever shape that holds on calmly and stubbornly through the very worst of the night. So let us now return, one final time, all the way back to that ship in the storm, lying just off the rocky shore in the screaming dark. Far below the wildly heaving surface, completely and utterly out of sight, that one small steel shape lies buried deep down in the mud. Every single time the howling wind shoves the ship backward, the pull travels straight down the long, sagging chain and tugs the buried anchor sideways. And every single time, that sideways tug does not pull the anchor loose at all, but instead quietly drives it a little deeper still. The harder the storm screams and heaves and shoves, the more fiercely the buried anchor grips, feeding hungrily on the very force trying to tear it free. That one tiny shape, weighing perhaps 1,000th of the whole ship, holds the entire vessel safe and still until the gray light of morning finally comes. And that, in the end, is the real and surprising answer to how something so small can possibly hold something so impossibly large. It was honestly never really about weight at all, but about one clever shape that reaches out and grabs the solid earth instead of fighting it. The anchor quietly reaches down, takes a firm hold of the entire planet beneath the sea, and then simply lets the planet do all the holding for it. Its strange curves and its sharp, cruel points are not decoration in the slightest, but are the precise and deliberate tools of digging, biting, and burying. So the very next time that you happen to see an anchor swinging small and harmless on the deck of some great ship, you will know far better. You will know that hidden inside that one simple ancient shape is one of the oldest and the cleverest tricks